I think we're live. Hey there, welcome to History Chats. There we go, cool. Welcome to History Chats this afternoon, on this very wintry afternoon here. Yeah, so we're gonna get started in a couple minutes here with another story, trying to sum up Wausau and a history of Wausau in a picture. So hopefully, I know last week we were having some internet issues, some program issues, and it ended up, hopefully I fixed the situation and we won't have it again, but in the event that the stream shuts off, we'll be back and just need to restart everything. And that'll get started in just, yeah. Hopefully it won't be an issue, but if you're watching live, if you're not watching live, don't worry about it. We will have fixed it if it happens, but if you are watching live, and the stream goes down, we'll be back in just a second. We'll pick up where we left off, but hopefully that won't happen. All right, so there's a quick update there, I guess. Yeah, so just fun. Even not more than 2 years into this, we still have technical issues. It happens. Anyway, this is where I would normally tell you about an event we're coming up, a History Speaks or open house or something. But I think for this year, we're pretty much, come to an end of those sort of things. More stuff coming up, hopefully in the near future. We'll be able to announce some stuff coming up for 2023. But for now, we're just going to finish out the month here, History Chats, and talk about some history, and we'll do that. Yeah. In fact, why don't we, I think maybe we can just jump right into the history, because nothing to vamp for. We'll just jump into it. Let me introduce Gary. He's going to tell us about the early to interwar era history in the 20th century of Wausau.
Thank you, Ben. Again, the challenge this month was to find some photos that represent a variety of different eras in Wausau's history. Last week we spoke about the later part of the 1800s. Today we're bringing you up into the 1900s, and the challenge today is to find a photo that somehow represents that interwar period between the end of World War I and the beginning of World War II. So basically it's the 20s and 30s. So with that challenge, I mean, it's difficult, but with that challenge, I came across this photo that I think in certain ways represents a certain era in Wausau's history. It's of course Main Street. It's a variety of different things going on, which we'll talk about. So this is, I'm pitching this picture into the late 1930s because of the variety of the stores, and we'll talk a little bit about that here and there. But of course, this is we're still in the Depression. You can tell by the Christmas decorations that, we don't have very much money to spend on Christmas decorations this day. So it's kind of the buildings look dark. It's sort of I don't know. It's just sort of, I think, very typical, I think, of what Wausau was like during those years of the Great Depression. Of course, there's a lot of other stories of Wausau in the 1920s and 1930s, but we'll try to hit on some of those, a variety of those stories. We'll try to bring those in as much as possible with regard to this picture and what Main Street was like in the end of the 1930s. So where are we? Well, we're in the 300 block of Washington. I'm sorry, the 300 block of 3rd Street, looking north, sort of in the middle of the block, looking north. So we're looking north towards Jefferson, looking north towards Scott Street, and we have Washington, that intersection of Washington Street and 3rd Street behind us. So here we are. So let's take a look. Let's see so what can you see? What are you seeing on 3rd Street? Well, one of the things that I see pretty clearly is the Wausau Theater marquee, taking a good, so the Wausau Theater was here pretty much in the early parts of the 1930s, and it was here until about 1960. And what was going on at the Wausau Theater? Well, if you see the marquee, the Clark Gable, there's the Joan Crawford and a Franchitone playing in something. Well, this is a 1936, I don't think it was color at that time, but this is one, a poster with Joan Crawford, Clark Gable, Franchitone in Love on the Run. 1930s, which indicates to me maybe that the Wausau Theater at that time wasn't running first run theater, most likely second run pictures at that time, but we don't know that. But Joan Crawford, Clark Gable, and Franchitone was in a certain movie at the Wausau Theater in the later parts of the 1930s. Of course, the Wausau Theater continued to be at this spot until 1960, when renovations started to happen in downtown Wausau. The Wausau name changed, moved over to a theater on 4th Street, but the Wausau Theater was here serving certainly the entertainment needs of the city of Wausau for a long time. It must be said that the Wausau, this was one of the early stage theaters also. So in the early days, there was some vaudeville being here in the old theater, but then eventually into the 1930s, motion pictures started to come in and sort of take over from vaudeville. You can see that at the other theaters in Wausau, the Grand Theater, sort of that same history. Also, the Ritz Theater on Scott Street was another theater that sort of served the vaudeville needs in the early days, but then eventually switched over to the motion picture. So again, a landmark in the city of Wausau was this Wausau Theater. So so a little bit before that, if we take a look close in on another storefront, we see the S.S. Kresge, what they would call the 5 and dime stores. So this was in the 300 block of 3rd Street, and eventually Kresge's would move over to the 400 block in the later part of the 1950s as part of the renovation of that 400 block after the courthouse was torn down. But just so that you know, Kresge's was here before the Kresge's on the 400 block that we all are familiar with. There was an S.S. Kresge here in downtown Wausau before that. So what else do we see on this picture? Well, what we do see is some trolley tracks. Again, trolleys or streetcars, pretty distinguished feature of downtown transportation and points north and south and west throughout from early 1900s to about into the early 1940s. So here are the tracks. They down 3rd Street, coming in, the wires on top servicing the power. So this is a picture from the Herald of the trolleys, and you can see that they're making a turn on Washington Street. I think they're preparing to go to the west side. You can see the tracks turning there. But again, in the 1930s, the history was starting to be written because there was this headline in the newspaper saying trolley lose race against progress, motor buses win, and thus the advancement of motor buses in the city will be taking over the long and distinguished history of trolleys or streetcars in the city of Wausau. So let's cross the street a little bit, and what do we? Well, we see this large towering building on the corner of Jefferson and 3rd Street. So what's this? Well, this is the First National Bank. This national bank has a distinguished history, beginning in the 1860s when Daniel Plummer, one of the distinguished lumbermen of the city, established the First National Bank here on the corner of 3rd and Jefferson Street, a distinguished building. This building was here for a long time. It served as other office buildings much after the service as a bank. Like I said, it started in the 1860s. Moving into the 1930s with the Great Depression, there was a great consolidation of the banks in 1933. And the First National Bank, this bank, merged with the old Marathon County Bank, or the German American Bank, and formed what we came to be called the First American National Bank, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But eventually, this building would be the First National Bank building would be torn down on this corner. But again, a strong banking presence. Into the 1930s, losing its banking history really in 1933. After that, it was pretty much an office building. This is, for instance, what that interior of that bank looked like for many years. Again, Daniel Plummer being one of the stalwart leaders of this community, being the president of that bank for many years. So then let's cross the street. We're just a quick little look at some of the buildings before we see the end of the block. The Harris Clothes Shop, so a lot of retail, a lot of businesses, and also with this block, we'll see offices of lawyers, doctors, dentists on the 2nd floor. You see that Mr. Monk, a lawyer, most likely he has his offices on the 2nd floor. Very typical in those days for dentists or doctors, lawyers, specific offices to be located on the 2nd floor of buildings, maybe even on the 3rd floor if by chance there was the 3rd floor to some of these offices. Offices on 2nd and 3rd floor, retail then on the main street level. Harris Clothes Shop down the street. So then again, another quick look at the street. We sort of covered both sides of the 300 block here. One noticed that on the right side of the 300 block, that's pretty much the way it is today. So if you go down the 300 block, you're going to see that the same architectural features on the 2nd floor. The bank, of course, is gone, but the rest of the block is pretty much the way it was here in the late 1930s. So then let's venture to the next block. So take a look. So now we're going to cross Jefferson Street. So we're going past the Wausau Theater sign. We're going to close in, for instance, on this block. And if you're familiar with downtown Wausau, the 400 block, well, these buildings are still here. And we'll talk a little bit about each one of these. But we're going to, first of all, narrow in on some of those streets on the west side of 3rd Street. So we see Mayor's Shoe Store, we see a cafe, and this cafe would be what we now know as the Mint Cafe, and we see the sign for the Hotel Wausau. So all of these are still here. A little bit of a closer look. the Rexall drugstore sign, Meyer Shoes, and the Meyer Shoe Store. This building is still here, one of the distinguished landmarks in the city. First of all, it was Marathon County Bank. Eventually, it became the Meyer Shoe Store. And since their closing, it has taken on a variety of other different businesses throughout its history. But again, a distinguished landmark in the city on 3rd Street. Further on down on 3rd Street, of course, we cannot help but mention the Hotel Wausau, now the Landmark Apartments. But again, what a distinguished building. Built in the 1920s, later part of the 1920s. Walter Schrader came up, built this hotel, and a distinguished building. Just a little bit of a sliver that you can see on our photo of the week, but still we cannot help but mention this great building as part of the landmarks of downtown Wausau. And if you glance down to your lower right, you're going to see the beginning of the construction of the First American National Bank building in the later part of the 1920s. So again, sort of a historical snapshot at a little bit of history here in downtown Wausau. So across the street from the 400, from the block of the shoe store as well as the hotel, you see some trees. Well, whenever you see trees in the downtown Wausau on a specific block, you know what that's hiding. Of course, the National Bank building, it's hiding the courthouse. So Marathon County Courthouse, this courthouse built in the 1890s, tore down in the 1950s. Again, a strong presence in downtown Wausau. And whenever there are shots of 3rd Street and trees, we know that this building, this Richardson Romanesque building, is a strong presence in downtown Wausau, serving as the courthouse for all those years. Unfortunately, it was torn down in the early 1950s, replaced by some retail shops. But in some ways, this block is still called Historic Courthouse Square. There's just a lot of history on that east side of the 400 block in downtown Wausau. I just want to cross Scott Street a little bit. Take a look. So going north from the hotel, crossing Scott Street, you come across to what was the First American National Bank. It was a state bank building. I think I'm not sure what's on the what the sign is saying today. But again, this was built in the later part of the 1920s, replaced by the current bank building on that block today, but a distinguished building in downtown Wausau. And if you glance down a little bit to your on the lower left, you see a log. And a log that had its history in the 1920s, cut down from Lincoln County. So a famous white pine log that sat on the courthouse grounds for many years, and eventually it was moved to Marathon Park, where it tells the story of white pine today. But it sat here on the courthouse grounds for many years. Looking at this picture this morning, I thought, I should mention that log that's sitting there on the courthouse grounds. So this is a picture of at one brief moment in time of the First American National Bank building, the lobby. I think it became I think this is more of a modern look. I think it had an older look when it was first built, but this seems to be quite a modern look of the bank building. Then across the street from the bank building, on the corner of Third and Scott is the McCrossan building. It's still there today. It's been clad with brick. But again, the oldest commercial building in the city of Wausau that we can realize. So again, a strong presence in downtown Wausau for many years. So here we have it. Again, just a little bit of a review. You can see why I'm sort of enamored with this photo, because it does, some things are a little bit hidden, but they again demonstrate and point to landmarks, point to history of what was going on in the commercial and in the retail, the banking, a variety of different interests in downtown Wausau for many years. If we step back from that exact photo, just come back to the corner of 3rd and Washington Street, we see a little different perspective. We see Winkleman's department store on your left. But with this view, you don't see the hotel, you don't see the bank building. You see the trolley, you see the First National Bank building, but it's a different view, and it's a different time in the city of Wausau. If you notice the department store on your left, there's only 2 floors. Eventually, there would be a third. As a little bit later, when you step back on that corner, Winkleman's department store now has 3 floors. You can see the hotel clearly marked down the street. The Wausau Theater marquee is still there. Just, I think, another view of the busyness of what Wausau was like. You can see a lot of pedestrians, a lot of what commercial businesses in downtown, the drugstore, more cafes, the Fox drugstore. But if you turn around, if you look, instead of looking north, and you look south, you'll see the City Hall at the end of 3rd Street, on Forest Street. City Hall built, I believe, in the later part of the 1900s, serving the city for many years until the new City Hall was acquired in the 1960s on Grant Street. But this history, this City Hall, of course, the work for Wausau, there's a whole story about that sign. But one of the things of the 20s and the 30s that I want to mention about the City Hall is that in 1922, Helen Ohm was elected the first woman to be on the city council. So again, a lot of history being demonstrated in this City Hall at the end of 3rd Street in the 20s and 30s. I tried to capture some of that history because a lot of things were going on in the 20s and 30s. And I think some of that is reflected in the City Hall and a lot of the movement into a big part of the 20th century. Again, another view of 3rd Street. This is looking south. This is, I think, in the 500 block of Wausau. Again, this is another view, busy view. Something's going on, maybe a parade down 3rd Street. Winkleman's on your left, of course, but a variety of different things. And of course, the busyness of Wausau. You glance up on your right, you see the 400 block businesses. This is an incredible shot of what Bargain Day perhaps was in the city of Wausau. But back in the early days of the 1920s and 30s, 3rd Street was our main street, and it continues to be our main street even to this day. And a little bit of a glimpse of what Main Street was like in the 20s and 30s for you today. So I hope you enjoyed that little glimpse of what Main Street was like back in the later part of the 1930s. So with that, I'll turn it back to Ben.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, so it's a difficult prospect. You got, and I'll note that Gary threw in a bunch more pictures than he needed to there, but it's hard to narrow it down, certainly when you have so many great pictures. So awesome. We're gonna continue this next week, again with another picture. I think this is the one I'm gonna use. I'm gonna be back and talk a little bit about sort of the next stage, the post-war era, the mid-century era of Wausau. I'm sure some of you can use this and already know exactly where we are, but for those of you who don't, you have to tune in next week and we'll tell you all about some of the developments that happened later in the century. But yeah, I think that's all I need to say here. So yeah, thanks for watching. And we'll see you next week with some more history.